Yeah. Right. Welcome, everybody. It's 7:05. So welcome to talk number 3 with Dr. Louisa Campbell, Trimontium Trust Winter Talks. We're getting used to our online talk program now, so hopefully the technology is working for everybody. The same as from the last few talks, please. If you have an issue technology-wise, please pop a message in the chat, and I'll see what I can do my end. There's a few things I can play around with here with the settings and stuff, and it might help you out. Please try and ensure your microphone is muted for the duration of the talk, and then if you have a question that comes into your mind at some point during the talk, then just pop that in the chat section. That means they're there and recorded safely, just in case your connection goes down or is limited. But what we'll try and do at the end of the talk is we'll try and call on as many people as possible who have popped a question in the chat feature, and you can ask it live to Louisa, which is always nicer than having it read out, but it just means we've got them there if needed. Okay, so that's about it from me in that respect. Really looking forward to do Louisa's talk tonight. I haven't been part of the trust when she's talked for the trust before. Some of the trust members and volunteers here may have heard Louisa talk before. I know we've got a lot of new attendees tonight, and fantastically, I've had some messages from overseas, people who've been able to join in with us when they wouldn't normally be able to make it to Melrose and the Borders, which for us as a trust is a fantastic kind of advance through these kind of COVID times when we're learning new technologies and we're trying new things out to get new audiences, and to be able to share like this is fantastic for us, fantastic for Louisa, and fantastic for the kind of field we're all working in and interested in. So enjoy the talk tonight, and I'll pass over to John quickly, who's going to say a few words before Louisa starts her talk.
Thanks, Rob. Good evening, everyone. I think we'd like to thank Rob in advance for all his technical wizardry of managing to get this to work. I have to say I've conceded defeat completely, and he's managed to pull it all together very, very smoothly. So thank you, Rob, and also thank you, Francis, for your publication of the talk across social media for the last couple of weeks. So that's been fantastic. And thank you all for turning up this evening. Great turnout for Louisa's talk. Those of you who are members of the Trust will know that Louisa is no stranger to us. Dr. Campbell is the LKAS Fellow, Leadership Fellow in Archaeology at Glasgow University. And I've known Louisa for some time now. I have to admit that I've read her doctoral thesis, all 400 pages of it, and it's pretty impressive. So if those of you, is it online, Louisa? Can people? It's
not yet online, no. It's not quite online because
very impressive
copyright issues.
Right.
Well, God help you.
I have to say, it makes a fascinating read for anybody that's interested in Roman Scotland. Now, the members will remember that Louisa came and spoke to us relatively recently, just before COVID, actually. She came to speak to us about the use of pigment in sculptural reliefs, and it was a fantastic talk, and it's based on that work and some of the other work she's done on the Antonine wall sculptures that she's come along to speak to us this evening. Those of you who are really keen on the Antonine Wall will know that the sculptures are a truly unique element of Roman remains in Scotland. Absolutely fascinating, and Louise has an absolute handle on this material. One of the great things about Louise's talks is she encourages us to look at things in a different way. And that different angle that she puts on these things, the perspective that she puts on it, comes across with great authenticity. So I'm really looking forward to this talk this evening, which is, she's entitled Flipping the Script in Colonial Narratives. So before any more ado, I would like to hand over to Louisa to give us this evening's talk.
Well, thank you so much, John, and thanks, Rob, and thanks to all of you for inviting me today. I'm really delighted to be able to share with you some thoughts after I think John's right, it was just before COVID when we could all actually physically be present in the same space that I last spoke to you about my research on the Antonine Wall and polychromy, the colouring of those distance sculptures. So I'm really delighted to be back here again, sharing with you some further thoughts that have resulted from my exploration with these Antonine Wall distance sculptures. And as John says and the title suggests, really my objective is to flip the script on these colonial narratives as they relate to Roman relief sculptures. And I'm going to be doing that by looking specifically at replication. And as John says, hopefully you'll see it as a slightly different angle to consider when you're interacting with these objects in the future. So what I would start by saying is that our understanding of the Roman presence in Scotland is traditionally viewed through a Roman lens, and that's influenced really by the fragmentary and heavily biased accounts of Roman authors and Roman material culture. And that includes these monumental inscriptions that I will be referring to as distance sculptures or distance stones. And the aspects I'm going to be exploring are connected to a strand of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project. And what that's doing is really connecting communities all the way along the length of the Antonine Wall, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And they're doing that through various really innovative and exciting different projects. So this is all kind of tied in. The work that I'm doing here is all tied into that, as I hope we'll see as we go through the talk. And just to give you an idea of the other things I'm going to be exploring tonight, I'm first of all going to start thinking about decolonising colonial languages. I'm going to be thinking about how museums shape our interpretations and they perpetuate these colonial narratives that we're accustomed to. And I'd like to start thinking about replicas as extended objects with their own composite biographies that are connected to the originals, and also as authentic objects in their own right that are worthy of creation and museum accession. I'll move then on to replication through articulation, and then I'll flip the whole script and start thinking about how we can think about these things and how we can consider emulation or inspiration through emulation, okay? So it's just a completely contemporary perspective of it. I'm working across two computers this evening, so if I get myself confused, please do forgive me, but hopefully we'll be all right. So what are the distance stones and distance sculptures? They're monumental inscriptions, and they've been recovered from the vicinity of the Antonine Wall in Scotland, and their historical and academic value is really immense. It's incomparable with anything else because they contain information on the Roman campaigns in Scotland that's not available to us from any other source. And they tell us about the legions who constructed that frontier, and that's the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th legions, and we know that because it's confirmed through the text that's inscribed upon them. And crucially, what they also do is they record the distance of the frontier that these legions have been constructing. Now, these are also inherently propagandist objects, and some of them incorporate iconography that document aspects of the campaign. And they also tell us about religious practice and deities and just other aspects of life on the frontier. And they also have some really nice decorative features as well that are quite unique to them. But they present that data and that information to us only from the perspective of Rome. Okay, they don't give us any other perspective. So as Jen says, my kind of remit, if you like, is to start to try to think about the alternative perspectives when we're looking at these objects and engaging with them. So these are really charismatic objects, and they have a power to polarize opinion, and I can tell you that from experience. Not always to my, in a positive way, I suppose, but anyway, they are charismatic objects, and they do invite the viewer, I would say to you, on a really emotional and tactile journey, and I hope to maybe take you with me on a bit of an exploration into that journey tonight. So, the first thing I'd like to address, as I mentioned, is colonial language and trying to decolonise our language in reference to them. And it's long been recognised in post-colonial studies that labelling Indigenous peoples, as is often the case, that are in conflict with Rome as natives or barbarians, has really got derogatory and racist connotations, okay? And that type of terminology, I think, is enmeshed in as much in contemporary colonial attitudes as it is to the propagandist language that was employed by Roman historiographers who were perpetuating the glory and might of Rome. And I'm suggesting that similar caution really ought to be exercised in how we how we refer to in the language we apply to these monumental inscriptions. These have, and I say that because they've been historically termed as distant slabs. Now, I think that's quite dismissive language. It's a dismissive label, and it's perpetuated, it's been sort of permeated scholarship for more than a century. And I'm going to argue that actually that term of slab conjures a notion of bland, uninspiring, plain stone blocks that are bereft of any cultural or artistic significance. And the term really kind of minimises their impact and meaning. If we're going to consider the perspectives of the people that were on all sides of the imperial divide, which I would suggest to you is what we should be doing. So I am personally uncomfortable with the term slab, and I'm going to be referring to them with alternative terminology in reference to what I suggest are really quite magnificent things. So I'll be calling them distant sculptures or possibly stones as we go through, but I won't be calling them slabs. So I'm going to further suggest actually that the language we associate with these objects is particularly important in giving a voice to the previously silent Indigenous occupants of the region, which is something I'm particularly interested in. So the Hunterian Museum holds all but 2 of the distant sculptures, and I use their imagery here not as a means of singling them out for specific criticism in any way, but only as an example for exploration and to make the point that curatorial interventions in museum spaces play a really pivotal role in our contemporary engagement with these objects. And that's particularly in the articulation of the stories that they're telling us and whose perspective is being promoted or memories invoked in their narration. And there are paradigm shifts in the display of ethnographic, what's traditionally called ethnographic collections. These have moved beyond otherness, invoking otherness, and nowadays they embrace these intercultural connections and entangled relationships, and they strip away any preconceptions of events distant in time and space. And I'm going to suggest that actually care should be taken in the display and interpretation of what we might call archaeological collections, which have a tendency to favour Roman perspectives and language over all others. Okay, but I'm also going to say that actually curated objects are not the only way of exploring past events, and the absence of things that explore the perspectives of subjugated peoples is actually equally powerful if that void can be embraced as a means of affirming their presence. And so curated objects are also ripe for reinterpretation, and that's really where I'm coming from with this. It's about reinterpretation. There's a kind of long-standing perception that we have all the knowledge we need to have about these distant sculptures, but that's not the case, not in my engagement with them. And I hope I can convince you of that tonight. And I want to sort of think about reshaping their colonial legacies and the language that's bound up within them that we've been exposed to. So research into replicas is gaining traction. Dr. Sally Foster and Professor Sian Jones of Stirling University, they've recently established a framework for dealing with replicas and recognise them as authentic objects in their own right. Worthy of study and creation. They call them extended objects, and it's part of what they term also as composite biographies that are linked to originals. And I'm going to say that actually we can take it a little bit further than biographies and start to think about materialisms and object itineraries, which might actually, I think, be particularly relevant because replicas actually collapse any distinction between past, present and future. And that enables us to really fully explore object entanglements and networks as pivotal to their narratives. But replication is not a new thing, and antiquarians have used replicas, long since used them for germinating new ideas and for research, for teaching, for exhibiting culturally significant material that would otherwise have remained inaccessible to most people. For museum audiences, this practice has created new entangled connections between people and things that have been collected from places that they've never and probably will never visit. And replicas, I think, then play a really important role because they fold in echoes of a distant past and they absorb new significance in their own right, really, as authentic and invaluable artefacts in their own right. And that's especially, I would say, if they're standing in proxy for an original object that no longer exists. And I'll come on to explain what I mean by that in a moment. So what I've been doing is I've been tracking some replica distance sculptures. Okay, this is a plaster cast of the Hutchison Hill sculpture, and it's currently on display in the Hunterian Museum. It's part of their Antonine Wall, Rome's Final Frontier exhibit. It's their showcase exhibit as you walk in the door. It's a fantastic display. Now, the original sculpture was taken to Chicago by the US consul in 1871, where it subsequently and tragically perished in the Great Fire. But fortunately, the Society of Antiquaries for Newcastle and Tyne, and they had the forethought to create some casts of this object before it was shipped out. And this is the one that was presented to the Hunterian. And you can see that actually some of the details were actually depicted in colour in 1979. And that's including the highlighting of text here in red, and some of the decorative features and iconography have been picked out in white. Now, we know also that 3 additional casts are known to have been made of this particular object, and they're now in the collections of the Museum of Antiquities in Newcastle, Chester Museums, and also Chester's Roman Fort. Now, there's a significance attached to this particular replica in the Hunterian that I'll touch upon in a moment, but it's a pivotal object, and that has been woven through the Hunterian's epigraphic story of the Roman presence in Scotland, because it now stands in proxy for an object, an original object that's now lost to the Great Fire. And if you've ever wondered what that piece looks like without the colour, this is the replica that is in display in Chester's Roman Fort. But we've got some other really interesting, just to throw this in as well, if you dig a little bit deeper, you can find some really interesting replicas of the distance stone. These are very almost unknown examples of wooden replicas that are actually in the stores of Glasgow museums. They're hidden away, nobody knows about them, but they're fantastic representations and replications of original things. So I thought a way to consider this today is to think about case studies, if you like. So I'm going to return here, if I may, to the Bridge Nest sculpture that we saw a wee while ago. This is the largest and one of the best preserved examples of distance sculptures. It has a 3-panel format, as you can see here, with a central inscription that's in familiar abbreviated Latin, and it's flanked with 2 really graphic images on either side that are set within architectural facades. On the right, I'll just move all our faces. On the right, we've got members of the 2nd Legion who are actually the dedicators of this sculpture, and they're participating there in a ceremonial sacrificial votive offering to the gods. You can see here they have a goat, a sheep and a pig, and they are offering a votive offering on an altar there. On the left, so on the left we have a Roman cavalryman who is running down and decapitating some northern warriors in the heat of battle. Now that's a really iconic image that most of you, I'm sure, will have seen in other frontier sculptures, and really it epitomises the attitude and propagandist practices that are commonly articulated on these Roman frontier sculptures. It's a means really of reinforcing Rome's superiority and domination over a region, but also of subjugating indigenous peoples. So it really effectively, if you like, normalises that position, and it cautions Iron Age peoples against any form of resistance. And it's effectively graphically reinforcing that resistance is futile, so don't bother trying. But Bridge Nest is also the subject of most prolific replications, so we can start to explore some of these extensions I spoke about earlier. This is a plaster cast of it. Again, some of you may be familiar with it. Actually, that is actually embedded into the Hunterian Museum's centrepiece exhibit as well. It was cast in 1911 as part of an exhibit of Romano-British sculpture that was shown in a special exhibit at Rome. Now, we know from an article that was published at the time that there was 165 casts of various sculptures made. I'm going to come back to that momentarily, but it's not clear how many of those casts are actually of the Bridge Nest sculpture. So we can't track the entire episode of that, that cast and those different replicas. But more importantly, I think here the point is that, like the Hutchison Hill example I showed you a moment ago, this cast is also woven through the Hunterian Museum's exhibit, because it too stands in proxy, this time not for a lost thing, but of an original that's set into the wall of the National Museum of Scotland's Roman exhibit in Edinburgh. And in fact, I would take that further and argue that without this cast, the Hunterian's Roman story would actually be entirely devoid of a beginning or an end, depending on your direction of travel through the exhibit. Okay, and yet this object has not been accessioned. It doesn't have a museum number assigned to it. Well, it does. It has a number written onto it, but it's not theirs, and I don't have time to go into that today. That's a story for another day. But the point is, unless you know of this object's existence and we're physically engaging with it on the museum floor, a researcher or interested member of the public would not be in any way aware of its existence or the powerful presence that it has as the largest and potentially most impactful objects on the display, or its pivotal role in the narrative of the Roman presence in Scotland. Okay. So it's a very important thing, but nobody knows it's there unless you're physically present with it. I've tracked down yet another episode in another replica from the Bridge Nest sculpture, and that is currently on display in Tully House Museum and Art Gallery in Carlisle. And here I'm going to address a dichotomy, if I may, from existing understanding of the trajectories of the Bridge Nest sculpture and the replicas, sorry, because it's another really informative aspect that's been revealed as a result of the research that I've been undertaking. As I was trying to find out a bit more and track these trajectories and these different replicas of the Bridge Nest sculpture, there were indications that it had been cast for, this one here had been cast for inclusion into an exhibit of the National Museum of Wales in the 1960s. And after that, it was then gifted and perpetuated to the Museum of Antiquities in Newcastle. But I found the proposition quite unconvincing that this had been explicitly made for that exhibit, because there was no reference to it anywhere, and none of the curators knew anything about it. I couldn't see the National Museum of Scotland allowing a new mould of it to be made. And so I found that rather unconvincing, and I did a little bit more digging on it. And actually I found that in the long run, through a bit of digging with the curator in the National Museum of Wales, that actually, yes, this was one of those 165 casts that were made for the 1911 exhibit in Rome. And along with that, there was other really interesting sculptures like which I'll come on to momentarily, a Tombstone of Glavinus from Corbridge, a life-size statue of Mars from York, etc. So most of these were then sold on to other museums and institutions across the UK and abroad. But this is a really interesting episode. So we've now been able to determine with certainty that a previously unknown episode in the life, if you like, of these originals and the associated replicas has now been revealed. That was, nobody had made the connection before. So anyway, it's another interesting piece. And as an aside, I found another thing that was really interesting is in Tully House, where they are presenting this, they call it a distant stone, not the slab terminology that's favoured by our Scottish colleagues. So I'm just saying, I found that quite interesting as well. So here we have another more recent replica. This is a machine drilled sandstone replica of the Bridge Nest stone, and it has been placed very close to the original find spot for the stone in Bowness, and that was done in 2012. This actually episode relates to another really interesting aspect of the Bridge Nest stone, and it starts to sort of bring in connotations of repatriation, if you like, of contested objects. Now that is another strand that we don't have time to go into today at all, and it's potentially quite a challenging strand to go into. But repatriation of objects is something that would normally be associating with ethnographic collections from museum, not something that is related to local communities along the length of the Antonine Wall. But there's an exploration there to be made, which I've done in a recent paper that I've got under peer review just now. And again, we don't have time to think about it today, but it's still an aspect of this piece that we need to consider, that there are communities connected to it that have it, that want a say in what happens with it. Another really interesting, if little known episode of the Bridge Nest sculpture's replication is this commemorative plaque, and that's been built into a stone wall at the roadside close to the original sculpture's find spot as well. And that was put up as a means of not only marking the original find spot, but also as a means of you know, thanks to the person who had donated it. The object came from their land. So you might not necessarily recognise it in the first instance as a full replication, because you can't, there's no iconography associated to it. It's just the central inscribed panel, but it's still a very important replica associated with the original here. Here we have a 2D scan that's been captured by Historic Environment Scotland, and that was used for that machine drilled sandstone replica that we saw that had been embedded into some stonework at Bo'ness. So all of these connections start to be drawn out, and the Bridge Nest is a really good example of one particular piece, one object that is replicated in lots of different formats and different mediums. And the connections between it, because in order to have that machine drilled sandstone piece that's now standing in Bo'ness, they needed to have a computer graphic of that, and this is that computer 2D image. Another replication you might want to think about is actually the digital reconstruction that my own work has revealed, which is a reconstruction, a digital reconstruction of that really iconic battle scene from the Bridge Nest sculpture, and I think it brings to life the whole essence of that really brutal scene of battle, where we have a Roman cavalryman riding down and decapitating these northern warriors in full colour. By a spooky coincidence, just recently the Royal Mail also replicated the Bridge Nest stone, and note their continued use of the word that we shall not use there. But anyway, I think perhaps more interestingly what they've done is they've used this more settled scene on the left, as we can see, of non-antagonistic image really of religious practice from the right hand side of the sculpture, rather than the much better known battle scene on the left. And I question whether this is because there's a growing recognition, especially in the context of Black Lives Matter and other movements, that the image of a colonial invader trampling all over Indigenous peoples is quite inflammatory, and it's perpetuating a notion and normalising, if you like, a notion of one group of people subjugating and brutalising another that's just no longer acceptable. And these are the kind of things that I'm suggesting we should be thinking about and exploring these objects. I just very briefly want to mention this. I mentioned just a moment ago the Tombstone of Glavinus, which is from Corbridge. This is another one of those objects that was replicated in 1911 for that exhibit in Rome of Romano-British sculpture. It is a tombstone of Flavinus, who was a signifier with a standard bearer really with the Roman cavalry. And you might recognise that iconography again of a Roman cavalryman who is riding down Indigenous people. So again, I mentioned it's a standard, if you like, a bit of a template, you know, type of iconography associated with the frontier sculptures. Again, as I say, there is that connection, because this was also one of the objects that was replicated in that 1911 exhibit in Rome. But in fact, there was another cast of this done in 1960, and it was this one was actually made in fiberglass, through fiberglass and chicken wire, and it was put onto wooden struts. It's not yet clear where the replica derives from, but this one here is not part of the one from the 1911. There was another one that Museum of Antiquities in Newcastle have. But we can't really, the point I'm making with this one is I can't track the full extent of the background of this one because the curators there have been unable to get me all the records due to COVID restrictions, but it's a really nice one. And what they've done is they've actually used some iconography there to try and bring that to life for an exhibit that they had in 2017 for the Hadrian's Cavalry exhibit. So just another nice example of a relief sculpture, this time from a different frontier, Hadrian's Wall, where people are finding ways of engaging with it and using replication in a different way. Again, another interesting twist of fate, both the original and that fibroplast replica were brought together very briefly in Wrexham Abbey, which is where this original was found. When Corbridge was undergoing refurbishment, the curators there brought that replica together with the original so that visitors could see the original and this colourful replica. I would suggest the colours aren't particularly authentic, but anyway, it's a nice way to try and bring the thing to life. And it starts to kind of, again, draw these connections and understand the entanglements, if you like, that are folded into these originals and replication. For bonus points, we also have this fantastic 3D renditioning from Newcastle University's Digital Heritage team. I'm not going to go into this. I just put it up there really to start thinking about if we're going to start to consider these things holistically and strip away colonial narratives, we're going to unpack all these relationships and events that are folded into them. Again, as I say, I'm not going to cover all the strands, but it's really just a graphic to help you start to think about a flavour of some of the entangled relationships that are embedded into these things and layers of meaning that are folded into replicas as well, as we can see at the bottom. That's another whole set of relationships and entanglements there that these things are engaged with in their act of becoming. But I would say the list is actually almost without end because, as we're going to see in a moment, hopefully some of these replica sculptures are going to move into new positions in a landscape. And that cultural landscape is going to invite new audiences and tactile sensory engagements in a way that's just not possible in the traditional museum setting. So, having looked at the historical replication, I just want to turn now, if I can, to more contemporary replicas. As I said, I'm consulting on the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, and one of the primary outputs from that project is the replication of 4 sandstone replicas, distance stones, sorry, and they're going to be installed close to their original find spots on the Antonine Wall. Now, there are 5 local authority areas that run through the Antonine Wall runs through, and so 4 of those are going to be replicated. And this is a project, just to give you a little bit of background, it's a collaboration between Historic Environment Scotland and those 5 local authorities, as well as funding through those sources and National Lottery Heritage Fund and Leader funding. So it was specifically developed as a means of kind of reaching out to local communities and helping them to celebrate and rediscover the Antonine Wall that was in their back gardens in many cases, in fact. But also to do that in ways that are meaningful to them. So they're effectively co-curators and co-creators of the projects that are being delivered. And one of these projects, as I say, is this replication of the distance sculptures. Now, the replication took 3 stages. The first one was a competition for students at City of Glasgow College, and they were tasked with creating 3D watertight images with colour overlaid onto them, and that's for use in lots of different medium, if you like. So they can be used for colouring in, for digital reconstructions, and for actually creating new versions of these things. So there's lots of different ways we can use these 3D, what they call watertight images. Okay, so that was a competition that was ran for some of the students there, and this is the winning entry with some colour overlaying onto it. It's not in full colour, but again, just some splashes of colour to give you an idea how one of the scenes at the side might have looked. And we even have the project's mascot. Yeah, just going to move that along. Maximus Minimus, who is the project mascot, who is guarding over the thing in the landscape there. So I quite like that. Ah, okay. No, this is not. Okay. Okay, so those images allowed us to then create 3D prints of those objects, of 4 of the stones, and those prints were then used by stonemasonry students. So these were apprentice students who were then able to use those 3D prints to give them a really authentic and life-size articulation of the original, and it allowed them to then understand the depth of the sculptural details as well as the actual inscriptions that were on the original, so they can then make these things or remake them in an authentic fashion. And what I've been doing through the start of this is charting them from their inception through to their conception, articulation, creation, and ultimately through their installation and their life use as they go forward. And future work is going to start to think about almost like ethnographic understanding of people's engagement with the thing once it is once they're set out into the landscape, people are able to kind of draw new connections with them. And that's all critical, I think, to recognising the significance of replicas, these particular replicas, and recording all of that for posterity. This is something we don't have about the original objects. It's really important if we can try to track that going forward. Okay, so replica production, I'm going to say, is really, if you like, it stimulates interest and active engagement with local people, but also with the things themselves and with museums, for example. So all of these things have been a collaborative process with lots of different individuals being involved and different technologies and different skills. And so the value in replica production really comes from collaborating really with these engaged communities and skilled artisans. And that's all part of the creative process and stimulating these new relationships and empowering, if you like, these engaged communities. But also to give them ownership of the old and the new thing. And one of the main objectives of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project is to start to extend the audiences that are engaging with these things. And working in partnership with City of Glasgow College was a really useful vehicle to start to inform and engage young people, because that's a group that's traditionally quite difficult to reach in terms of heritage studies. And it helped them to start to think about engaging with the wall. And it also offered some really unique training opportunities. So what we can see in the top 2 images is the roughing out stage of 2 of these replicas. And you can start to see, I think if we can see here, it's been sort of drawn on in pencil, but we can start to see how these young people were actually articulating the carving out of the iconography here. And at the bottom, we can see how that played out, and they're starting to come together. We can see them as almost finished pieces. Here, if you can just follow my arrow here, you can see that's the 3D, some of the 3D prints I was speaking about. It gives them the depth and the authentic size of the object so that they can then use that to articulate onto the stone. These are really important aspects, as I say, we can track, and also these young people are gaining some really critical life skills here, something that they'd never thought possible in the past. As I mentioned, ultimately these things are going to be put out into a landscape, and this is going to allow local community to start to interact with them in a different way, and they can interact with them at any time of the day or night. And that means that they are going to be unhindered by any other elements such as museum opening times or no touching policies in museums, or restricted spaces, LED lights that give you a false ambience, if you like, associated with them, or even access to digital technologies that drive remote immersive content that's so important to these things these days. So all of that is stripped away, if you like, and people can come in and actually engage with them on a one-to-one basis. And then that, taking that forward, the newly created sculpture then starts to absorb and project these rich and diverse meanings to a multiplicity of people that and places. And normally, you know, some of these people wouldn't have necessarily gone into the museum to see them. So it gives them a whole new dynamic, if you like, and it nurtures a whole new network of invested collaborative partners engaging all these new audiences. So it's really a valuable piece of work, I think. And that's hot off the press. That is one of the finished pieces. It looks as if it's not finished because it's very small, but in fact, that is one of the finished replica sculptures, and it is based upon a fragment of one of the Arne Bog piece. Okay, so it is completed. It's not that they have only done a bit of it. That's the fragment that survives for that area. But I think they've done a superb job, and especially since it's something that these young people had never done before. So in fact, the college is now thinking about putting on a new course for actually helping young people gain these heritage skills that they wouldn't have ever had before. So that's another output from the project that's going to be really valuable. This is another one of the pieces. This is the sculpture from Eastern Mains. It is now finished. It has been installed at Twecker Healthy Living and Enterprise Centre. That was done before Christmas. Most of these things should have been done, you know, before the end of last year, but the timetable has been pushed forward, unfortunately, due to all the restrictions that we've had. But I hope you'll agree this is a beautiful piece that's now set out into the landscape that people can actually engage with and draw their own new connections with. So coming now to think about, you know, how do we, replicas are defined here as extended objects. They've got their own itineraries, they're worthy of investigation, and they're objects that draw direct influence from and are based upon replicating originals. But there's another type of replication here that I want to explore before I finish up, and that is originals that they're objects that are based upon these originals, but actually what they do is they develop newly conceived content. And I think they merit our consideration. And I'm categorising these in a connected category, really. I'm defining as a relational object because they are entangled and immersed in shared meanings and memories with an original artefact, but they do deviate in fundamental respects. And I'd argue that those types of objects are actually free from the burden of perpetuating a colonial history of originals that aren't permitted to change. And by that, I mean they're not permitted to change in the mindsets of either museums or visitors, or even perhaps, dare I say it, established scholastic legacies of museum curators or, you know, some of our established scholars, perhaps. And I don't mean that again as a criticism necessarily, but, you know, people, sometimes you have to look at these things with a fresh eye. And in fact, it also deviates from new technologies that are quite common in the museum setting, using digital technologies, for example, because in fact often digital technology by their very nature actually are quite reliant on unchanging histories. Okay, so the originals provide a stylistic framework for some of these relational objects, but as I'm hopefully going to show you, newly created things then leave participants with an artistic license to start to create new meanings and associations from different dimensions and also alternative perspectives. And we can start to explore some of these things with a newly created relief sculpture that is based upon the originals, but it deviates significantly from them. So this is what I'm considering through a theme, if you like, of replication, which is inspiration through emulation. Now, earlier this year, we had some stone sculptures from the Scottish Borders, Josephine Crosland and Luke Batchelor. They were commissioned to design and create a brand new 5th sculpture to be part of that Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project. And that is the one that effectively flips the narrative on these originals. And it follows, as you'll see here, that familiar 3-panel format with a central inscription, flanked by iconographic imagery. But there are 3 major differences between this one and the original. Okay, so firstly, apart from the date, as you'll see at the very bottom, which is articulated in Roman numerals for 2020, the text is inscribed in English. It's not that abbreviated Latin that we see on all the Roman originals. And that's as a means of sending a message to contemporary audiences who can engage with these things directly. What would they care about necessarily abbreviated Latin? So it's in English to make it accessible to these contemporary audiences. And the inscription itself actually commemorates the Antonine Wall, Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, but also the 21st century legions. And that is actually the term that's used. It's the name given to a legion of volunteers who have made the entire project possible. So it's a shout out to them. It's a commemoration of them effectively. And they have played a pivotal role in the delivery. So rightly so, they should be commemorated there. Secondly, the iconography takes inspiration from the sculptural style, as we'll see, as we saw earlier. Also the technique and the content of the original, but it reverses that oppressive colonial imagery. This time it's juxtaposed and viewed through the lens of the local people who have come into conflict with Rome. Thirdly, it considers contact between the potential for a more settled reciprocal interface between the Romans and the non-Roman occupants of the region, as opposed to that antagonistic, hostile thematic iconography that we saw in the originals. So that is the finished piece, and I hope you agree it's absolutely fantastic. I'll just move this out of the way so that you can get a better view of it and all the iconography that's involved. So they say it is a contemporary and really provocative piece of art in its own right, and the depicted scenes here they're really subversive and they're in direct conflict with the originals. They're designed to elicit an emotional response in the viewer, and it invites them to consider different dynamics and new dimensions in the really in that contradictory perspective of local Iron Age peoples who had a really very different experience of events than the Roman military personnel at the time. And that's the narrative that typically frames our understanding of the time and the iconography that we've been exposed to. So on the left, we can see here that iconic scene of battle that we saw earlier in a couple of the pieces. But actually it features now a new protagonist. This time we have a northern warrior who's charging into battle with fallen Roman soldiers. He's on a horse-drawn carriage. We've got evidence of that from Scotland. So that's bringing in that archaeological evidence as well. And what he's doing, if you can see on the side there, is he's actually roused into battle by the melodic and haunting drone of the Desford Carnix. I'm not sure if members will be familiar with that. It's a kind of trumpet-like feature which has, you know, a beast at the top of it. On the right, we have a more settled scene. We have a local couple who are interfacing with the Roman personnel. They have a jug that they're holding in between them, and that's filled actually here with Roman coins, and that's referencing the Falkirk hoard, which also contained a fragment of tartan. I don't know if you can quite make that out here, but in fact, the chap has some of that fragment, you know, articulated in his outfit here, as has the northern warrior on the back of that chariot. So again, it's bringing in the archaeology of the time. There is a Falkirk hoard that was filled with coin, and these wonderful tartans are being drawn out and articulated in the stone. In the background, we have, I don't know how familiar you are with them, but we have a formidable, uniquely Iron Age structure in a broch, which is a high dry stone tower. As I say, it's unique to Scotland, and beside that we have sheaths of corn, which is really a shout out to the domestic, the agricultural practice that was prevalent at the time. So again, just to think about, this is where we're flipping the narrative here. We're thinking about, in the act of becoming this new object, is creating a sense of enchantment and performance through the transformation of a plain stone slab into a new thing, and it's possessing new properties and tangible meanings that really contradict the stories told on these originals. It invites intimate, tactile, I hope anyway, and emotional and sensory engagement through these sculpted narratives and the materiality of the stone. And I say that, you can't, I'm sure, have failed to notice these red kind of, you know, aspects that are permeating through the stone. And I think that that's a natural feature of the stone, but it lends itself really well to the iconography and to the subject matter, because it emulates red pigments that were on those originals that we saw earlier in my digital reconstruction anyway of that scene where there was blood in that battle scene. And I think that natural red flowing through the stone kind of gives you that, that sort of flavour as well. And it creates, I think, a really dynamic and visually impactful effect, as I say, of blood seeping through that stone and permeating it, imbuing it with a new sense of realism. So this is where I talk about the flipping of the narrative, starting to think about things in an alternative dimension. And this is the local communities were really keen to explore these new dimensions in their stone, because there was no stone for that Falkirk area, and they wanted to participate in the designing of a new stone. And so I think they've done an amazing job, and the artists have done an amazing job in trying to flip that narrative and take alternative perspectives in it. And going forward, these local communities are going to start to be critically engaging with their new sculpture as well, and they're going to start, hopefully, to create their own connections with it through the stories that have yet to be told. And some of those, I hope, will deviate quite significantly from the narratives that we have been exposed to from the originals. So I think that's really all I probably want to say about it. I hope I've convinced you these are worthy of looking at in an alternative way, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Louisa. That was marvellous. It was fascinating from start to finish, and from my perspective, that engagement with those young people engaging in the kind of modern aspect of replicating the objects is just fascinating, as well as all the other aspects you talked about. It takes me back to kind of my early days in museum engagement with youngsters creating their own replicas to try and get their own kind of perspective on our collections. And we had a massively strong unit that we used to work with youngsters on the advantages and the use of replicas in the galleries and for themselves and stuff. So for everything you say tonight was fascinating. So thank you so much. I think John's probably got a question to kick us off. So if John's got his mic opened, are you there, John?
Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Louisa, for a wonderful talk, a great follow-up to your previous talk on colour in Roman sculpture. I loved it. As I said at the start, it helps us look at things in a different way, and it certainly, throughout the talk, as Rob said, it's just opened my eyes to a number of things. So I've got a couple of comments and then a question. First comment is, what a fantastic idea that replicas in themselves are collectible iconic objects, and that for us, coming to the final countdown to our own museum reopening, so many of our objects are replicas, and some of them are wonderful replicas, and Donald never missed an opportunity to collect a replica whenever there was one up for sale or up for grabs, and he had the perspicacity to collect these things. And so we've got, for example, a replica saddle that is absolutely exquisite, that's it's being renovated as we speak. And I think it's a Peter Connolly original, which has a whole story in itself to that saddle. And the replica face masks, for example, one of which was James Currell's own possession. So these things, I think, will now have a new meaning for us. They won't just be, you know, sad imitations, or, you know, and some people don't like to, you know, go to museums that only have replicas, like the Sutton Hoo Museum's only got replicas, for example, or nearly all its replicas. But if you go with a different view to look at the replicas as objects in their own right, I think it adds a whole new layer of meaning. So thank you very much for opening our eyes to that in a big way. The next observation, I think, is in the quality of some of these replicas and just where they get to. I mean, yeah, I never imagined that these things had a life. And thank you for helping share some of the background to some of those lives. And it's given me the notion that we should perhaps look at some of the objects that we've got and just find out where they've been, who's had, and where they've come from. And the final thing is a question, I suppose. And the fact you've got this slab up, not slab.
Oh no!
Sculpture.
That's it, Howie.
So she says 60 minutes and he's learned nothing. But yeah, who's ever heard of the Parthenon slabs? I mean, nobody talks about the Parthenon slabs, it's the Parthenon sculptures. But because you've got this sculpture up, it does spark the question in me that how do you tell the story of people who, because the Romans are half the story, and how do you tell the story of people who are archaeologically mute in a sense? And this is certainly one way of doing it, but I'm interested to see that the Antonine Wall Rediscovery Project's icon is the Roman cavalryman, but the indigenous people are missing from that. So you can see even your project struggles with trying to give a voice to people. So do you get any suggestions of how we can do that?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, it's a case of, you know, we have to embrace the void that is left by these people. We can't just ignore them and say, oh, well, there's nothing there's nothing to be told. We have to look in unexpected places. You know, having ploughed through my thesis, John, you'll know that my own thesis and my own interest, and I think you can see that very clearly, my own influence on, this is not my end product here, but I certainly had, you know, I'm invested in it, if you like, and I had conversations and input around it. I think we have to look for alternative perspectives here, and we have to be imaginative in how we do that. My thesis and my interest is in looking at those alternative perspectives and understanding the other side to that cultural divide, because, as I said at the start, almost everything we know about the Roman presence here is what we are told from the Roman perspective, because it survives well. Roman pottery survives well. We have the standing remains of Roman forts and of the Antonine Wall itself, and of these iconic stone sculptures, for example, that survive well. We have this fantastic, as you have from Newstead, you have fantastic survival of material in some anaerobic conditions. Bar Hill was the same. We had some fantastic things there. From my perspective, when I was trying to understand the non-Roman side of things, I did that through exploring how Roman objects were being used in alternative perspectives. So there's a running theme from particularly Roman scholars, that if Roman objects are found in non-Roman spaces, then that means the people who are receiving them and using them in some way are becoming Romanized, or they had an intensive relationship and a positive relationship with Rome. But that's not always the case, and I think we can see how it was used, how these things were used, how they were deposited, tells a different story. And we just have to look deeper. And you know, oftentimes in the past, for example, a lot of the excavations were quite dismissive. Maybe not all of them. I'm not being critical of colleagues here, right? But there's all there. As part of my thesis, I did a review from the 1940s of all the excavations of Iron Age and Roman sites, for example, and it was very, very clear that Roman was the, you know, it was the pièce de résistance, it was the motivating factor, it was the thing that everybody wanted to know about. But there's alternative, you know, excavations that can be called upon there. There's lots of material in museums that can be looked at again with a new perspective. We can look at that material and we can seek out the people who were engaging with Rome. We can try to draw out their stories and their narratives by doing things like this, by understanding that they would have had this alternative experience of the event. And so you just have to try and find ways to have their voices heard, you know, and not accept the way. I'm probably quite a protagonist in this sense that I don't accept necessarily always the Roman perspective on things. I want to understand the other side of things. Well, how was that received? What was the reaction to that? You know, that Roman narrative.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, just as I said, the iconography on this particular sculpture, where you've got the two Romans handing over the tribute to the indigenous people to sort of keep the peace, or, you know, as a sort of peace offering, as an explanation for the Falkirk Hoard, I think is fantastic. Can I ask you, by the way, where this sculpture is going to go?
This one, hold on, I need to find out, because there was some changes to, and I'm not sure entirely of the remainder of where everything is going. I think, yeah, that one is going to Cowwind and Falkirk. So
right.
I knew it was going to Falkirk, but I wasn't sure exactly where. Cowwind is it? So all of the sculptures are going to go close to the wall, but obviously the wall is a protected monument, so it can't go on the wall. So they're all going to places quite close and in the local authority area from where they were found. So that's Cowwind, and that's a very accessible place that local communities can access it at any time, day or night.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks, Louisa. We've got a question if Nancy's still with us and can unmute her microphone. Did you want to ask your question, Nancy?
It was just the iconography of the feather on that new stone. Is there a particular relevance? I've lost Louisa. Oh, there you are. Yeah, so what is it?
So in one of the sculptures, you'll know that the eagle is the icon of Rome. The aquila is the icon of Rome. It's the emblem of Rome, and that in one of the distance sculptures, the Summerson Farm distance sculpture, there is a representation of an eagle sitting on top of one of the legionary emblems, and I've done some work on that, and has shown that there was red, which I'm suggesting was iconography of blood, a representative of blood on the beak of Rome, representing Rome feeding off the blood of her subjugated peoples. But that eagle is quite often represented in the iconography of Rome. So the feather and the fact that it's fallen on the bottom there is representative of the fallen eagle, if you like. So there wasn't enough space, or to articulate a fallen eagle. So the sculptors did something really innovative and had that kind of shout out to the eagle, and just having it fallen lightly on the bottom.
Lovely. Thanks, Nancy. That's great. And thanks, Louisa. Damien was over in LA, and he's thanked you for your talk, tuning in from across the pond. And we've had 3 or 4 people who've had to leave who have thanked you very much for your talk, Louisa. Sharon amongst them, Sharon Camp. If Rachel's still with us, I think Rachel's got a question. If you want to unmute your microphone, Rachel. Are you still here? If not,
yes, I am. I am, Rob.
Brilliant. Fire away, Rachel.
Thanks, Rob. Louisa, thank you so much. That was just fantastic. Really, really fascinating. And this is just a tiny little question. I was intrigued so intrigued when I saw those little wooden versions that you showed at the beginning, and I just wondered where you found them, when were they made, who was making them, why do you think they were made, and why wood? Is it just practicality, cheapness of the wood, or I just would like to hear a wee bit more about them.
The truth is, Rachel, I don't have any background on those particular ones because it was a flippant remark that someone made to me a few years ago, and I thought, I'm going to go and search them out. So I contacted the curator at Glasgow Museums, and I went down. She very kindly allowed me to come down and take some photographs of them. They're only about that size. That's how small they are. They're not huge things, but they're articulated beautifully, and their representation of, you know, the replication, if you like, of the originals is spot on. So I don't know, is the truth of the matter, but that is really, no, it's a really interesting question, and it's definitely something for this particular work. Something that John said in one of the comments that he started with there was on replication. I think there is this snobbery, there has been a traditional snobbery against replication as being a worthwhile thing. But in fact, I think we need to embrace it as something that is very worthwhile. It's a way for us to articulate and understand things that, and actually engage with them in a way rather than a fragment. An articulation of the original, it brings something really significant and meaningful to.
Yeah, I quite agree with John's comment. I think you're right. Yeah. They've got a value all of their own. Yeah, thank you.
I for this piece, I decided to focus on. So part of my work in this paper, if you like, I've written a paper about it now, but I had to kind of focus on a strand of it to try and kind of progress where I'm coming to with it, which is, it's not just the original or a replica that's interesting. It's trying to kind of understand the network, the nexus of all these things. Where do they come from, and how do they come into being, and where do they go, and how do they get used? And, you know, as John says, I think it would be really useful to try and understand the path that your replicas have taken in the museum. And certainly I would like to do exactly that for those wooden things, and for any other replica that I see. I had to start somewhere, so I decided to start with the Ridge was the one that had the most prolific replication, so I wanted to kind of use that as a centre, as a case study to show how we might be able to do that and find new layers of or episodes in the trajectory. So I absolutely expect to go and find out more about those now. But that's a great question.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rachel. And you're dead right. Tonight has made me think about so many different things over the past that I've been working with over the past 20 or so years, and working with those specialists who make different replicas, and the lifetime of work they put in to be able to create these objects. It's got me thinking of all sorts of things, which is wonderful. Ian and Avril, are you still with us? I think I can see you on the screen there. Yeah, you had a point you'd like to make to Louisa.
Yes. Can I just pick up though about replicas? There's quite a tradition of making replicas. For example, there are many copies of the Parthenon frieze in different parts of Britain. In Brodie Castle, there's a replica of the bust of Pericles. It was dug up at Tivoli in 1767. So there is a long tradition of people copying things like that, presumably for historic houses, interesting buildings, to put up a replica. But my actual question was, these all presumably were on the south, facing the south on the Antonine Wall, not the north. So I tended to imagine that the indigenous people, when I saw the Burness slab, Stone's distance, sculpted stone, I used to think this is a warning to the natives that watch out what will happen to you if you oppose the Romans. But presumably it wouldn't be seen by the indigenous people, it would be seen by the Romans themselves. So it was really just to reinforce the Roman propaganda of themselves being the top dogs and so on.
I think that would be their primary objective, certainly, Ian, but I mean, I have another whole controversial thinking on where these things were located. I would suggest that yes, they probably were to the south of the wall. for maximum impact and for maximum audience. So we wanted, obviously, the Romans obviously wanted as many people to see it as possible, but actually I think they would want the local people to see it as well, because they needed to reinforce that message, iconography, and that propagandist message of do not try to, you know, go against us, because this is what will happen, you know, and you will be subjugated, you will suffer terrible consequences. So I think it would have been, I think actually it would have been a primary objective, yes, would have been for a Roman audience to demonstrate the might of Rome in a very clearly articulated way, a snapshot, if you like, in much the same way as the historiographers were writing long texts about, you know, and epics on. You can do that. You can do the same job in iconography and small, articulated in text as well. But actually, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I do have a controversial perspective on where these things were located. I don't necessarily agree they were embedded into the wall. I think there's a potential case for them to have been, you know, placed along the military way, which is where they might have had bigger impact, and they would have been able to be viewed by anyone walking along it. And I doubt that the local people would not have used that road if it was available to them. So I think actually we need to think again. I think there's lots of layers to these things that haven't been explored before. I've recently published a paper on that. And I think that's something we need to seriously think about, because none of these things were found on the wall. They were all found away from the wall, and they were all found pretty much to the south of the wall. Some of them a wee bit of a distance away. So what I would suggest to you is to think about, you know, in the same way that if you're going along, some of them have duplicate figures on them for distances that have been built by each legion, and they've been found quite close together. And I would suggest to you that actually, in much the same ways, if we're driving along a road just now and you'll get a sign that says so many miles to Glasgow, and in the other direction it would say so many miles to wherever your other destination is, what's to say they weren't there? Wouldn't that be the most sensible place to put something like that, rather than embedded into a wall where it's in the middle of nowhere and no one's ever going to see it? Even the Romans wouldn't see that if it was on the wall.
Thanks, that's a good point.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. There's one last question you had, Ian. Would you like to ask your last question, because it's fascinating, your last question? So do you want to pop that one as well?
In terms of calculating what measurements are mentioned, I know the Bridgeness one mentions measurements, quite a few maybe don't, I'm not sure. Is it likely that there are some slabs missing? Sorry.
Oh, yes. Ian, I think that's a perfect question, and I think you should read my paper. You should have written my paper. But yes, I think that I think there are two distance sculptures that do not have dimensions on them. In the past, they have been dismissed as wasters. They're not wasters, they're incomplete. They have everything else articulated upon them except for the distance. So they are incomplete, and they were done in advance of being placed where they were intended, I believe anyway. They were created, intended to be placed in a particular location, and they waited only for that distance to be confirmed so that it could be inscribed upon it. And so I think that's what happened, and I think there probably are some that and again, I'll get into trouble from the establishment here, but why would there not be? How arrogant would it be of us to assume that we had all the knowledge and that we had acquired all the pieces, and that, you know, in the past scholars have used all the distances that are on the ones that we have to extrapolate the length of the wall. Okay, now I have some issues with that I'm not going to go into just now, because I'll really get into trouble, but I think it would be quite arrogant of us to think we have a comprehensive story here. I strongly suspect, put it this way, almost all, there's a common thread through scholarship just now that says they were almost all found in the West, right? And the ones in the West were quite closely together. right? They were found quite closely together. And in the east, there was big distances between them. Actually, there's none found past Cumbernauld. Between Cumbernauld and Bowness, there's none. There's you know, I could show you a map, which I've done to extrapolate that point. I'm not popular for having done it, but anyway, it's there in black and white. And in actual fact, these things are not they're not more common in the west in their wider space in the east. There's almost none in the east, in fact. So we need to think about these things. I think a lot of them were more found in the west because different farming practices. They were north of Glasgow, an industrial area. There was a lot going on, lots of, you know, improvements, if you like, in the farming. So and the canal was being, but all of that, right? All of that has a part to play, I think, in it. So I think I'm always on the lookout for another one. I'm always waiting for a phone call to say, oh, I think we might have found something interesting.
Thank you very much.
Lovely.
Lecture tonight. Thank you so much. Good.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Louisa. I'll just finish up with mention the comment from Stuart White at Brady and Roman Villa, who had to leave at 8 o'clock tonight. So he thanked you greatly for your talk. Fantastically interesting. Great to hear your research and the way you were talking about replicas tonight. And as he says, he's always grateful when he rocks up and finds a good cast in a museum somewhere that he can get his beady eyes on and his hands on, obviously, very often, which is fantastic. I'd like to extend the Trust's thanks to you, Louisa, for tonight. Really informative, really interesting talk, and really enjoyed ourselves. And I'd just like to thank all those who attended tonight. We've had lots of familiar faces from the Trust and from the volunteers, and lots of new faces from around the globe, which is wonderful. I've received various messages from people who appreciate the fact that we can meet this way. We've been forced into, in some ways, adapting and learning these technologies, but I think we'll all admit that it's given us kind of new avenues and new ways to share research, information, and get together in a virtual room. And so before we kind of sign off for the evening, just thanks so much, Louisa. Very much appreciated, and look forward to meeting up in some time in real life.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all your wonderful questions, and thanks for inviting me. It's been really interesting, and I'm very pleased to have a chance to come along and chat to you.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks Louisa. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, see you. Thanks for your questions, everyone. Thanks, bye.
Thank you.